Well, thank you for joining, guys. What I'd like to do first is just have each of you take 60 seconds and introduce yourself and talk about your involvement in 5G and what it means to you and how your company is contributing to the process.
Yeah, thanks. Live.
1, 2.
All right, thanks. Hi, my name is Sanjeev. I work for Qualcomm Research in product management to cover the cellular projects. So 5G is, of course, one of the areas that we're looking at and have been looking at for some time. What we aim to do is look at the vast number of use cases that connectivity are important for and try to put those together into a technology solution that meets those requirements, at the same time as providing an operator a toolbox from within which they can reach to satisfy areas that they are in today, as well as areas they want to get in the future. And I think also one of the areas we're looking at is to enable application providers or service providers to tap into the power of the cellular network more than they have been able to do today.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Erik Ekudden. I'm head of technology strategy for the Ericsson group. I'm based here in the Bay Area. And 5G is actually starting already now, the way we look at it. And it starts with a transformation of the core network into a cloud core. This is where we virtualize all the applications in the network, and we put them on one common horizontal infrastructure, so you can actually run those network applications as well as any other application in different places in this network platform, not only in the central data center, not only at the edge, but all the way out into the access, if that makes sense, to meet some of those latency requirements that you heard about before. So if you really have an application that requires millisecond latency, you better distribute it all the way out into the network. And this new network platform that we're starting to build right now, the 5G ready core, it will take care of that. But it's also the new accesses. So Wi-Fi today and LTE obviously, and by 2020, or actually a little bit sooner than that, we will have another new access, and that access will provide low latency, high bandwidth, much more capacity because of the higher and broader frequency bands that we will use for 5G access. And that in itself is an enabler for video use cases. So 5G, in our view, is very much about IoT, but that's starting now with the IoT access that we develop during next year. But it also includes the video use case, basically providing fixed and mobile places with really high quality video delivery. So IoT, but that's starting now, and of course media a few years later.
Hi there, I'm Mark Platshon with BMW's Corporate Venture Group. I'm here in the Valley, the West Coast guy for BMW. Everybody's talking about connecting light bulbs and smart meters and stuff as part of their IoT strategy. Well, we also work on IoT, but we have the better T. We have cars, which are really cool things. Anyway, so we've been looking at DSRC and other vehicle-to-vehicle infrastructure, all the mobility services and autonomous car things that we want to do and develop and services we want to provide. And we've been one of the renegades, BMW's been one of the renegades of saying, you know, we're not going to do this DSRC stuff, we're just going to wait for 5G. So we don't want to wait too long, so let's get going.
Hello, my name is Punit Chiniwalla. I help run the US office for Singtel Innovate, which is the venture group for Singapore Telecom. For us, we invest primarily in either above the network applications or network infrastructure type things that make things faster, cheaper, enable new services. From a Singtel perspective, connectivity is sort of their bread and butter of where they've been making money historically, and IoT opportunities is a great opportunity to build a whole new business that seems to be growing really fast, and ideally 5G be one of the drivers as you get to new technologies that are out there. I would say like every other telco, it's sort of a challenged a business model, because you can always connect to an alternate service, something like Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or some other way of getting connectivity where you lose the customer to a third party that's making money, and the over-the-top app then takes the money from you in some other fashion. And so from a carrier perspective, it's always been a battle of how do they own and move up the stack with services. And that's the perspective that I think Singtel has. And as an investor, we look for how do you build standalone businesses that take advantage of that macro trend.
Okay, very good. Now, I think Punit did a pretty good job of explaining 5G and some of the overview of what a network slice is and how the network will be flexible to handle broadband 5G applications compared to IoT applications. In the interest of time, maybe we'll skip over that technical stuff and go to talking about the business models. I'm interested to get your perspective, guys, on, to me, there's a lot of different business models that can come out of 5G. Just focusing on the IoT side, there are new ways for the operators to make money, new business areas that are completely different than paying for smartphone data. And so I wonder if maybe, Punit, we can start with you to talk about how do you see some of these new business models emerging, especially for IoT that might relate to 5G, and how do you see the industry realigning itself to support that?
I will say it's probably fairly early in the process here to figure out what the right appropriate business model is. Like I mentioned, the carrier owns, to their belief, some ownership of the customer or the enterprise that they're selling into. And so there's a belief that this is a high-quality signal layer that you're delivering. And as you move to IoT or 5G on top of that, as a delivery of that, there's an opportunity to offer a reliable service. And we talked about this offline. And I think there is a position for the carrier to take and say, here's a trusted managed service that comes in there that provides X nines of service for these critical applications. I also think that that's not going to work for everything in the layers that are out there. And so to find how you segment the population of the buyers from the consumer to sort of the soft enterprise to the hard enterprise to the hard industrial to maybe deep energy applications, I mean, there's going to be different business models for each one of them that goes forward. And I think there's still a lot of macro motion in that direction so that you can take advantage of it.
Any other thoughts on that?
I think as Punit mentioned, there's in a sense the operator has partial ownership of the relationship with the customer, and right now that is with mobile cellular. But as they see saturation in that space, there's a strong desire, and there's actually an actualization of moving into new areas. Say it's Verizon with video or AT&T with satellite-based pay TV. And so it's completely natural that we should expect that they would broaden to capture more of the value rather than, especially since they have that customer relationship.
Well, I think that the one thing that is for us very different in 5G compared to 4G and all the other Gs is that your T is very different this time. And I think we've tried this as an industry before to get global scale of access technologies that reach a lot of things that are not phones and PCs or laptops. And I think this is a time when we're actually going to be successful in doing that, partly because of technology maturity that is actually possible to support some of the critical use cases, but partly because this is a game about global scale, that you have to play with technology that's embedded in every sensor, every car, every whatever you have at home. And that's the only way to make a business out of it. But that business also has to have a very strong influence from the industry at hand, whether it's a automotive industry or it's a home appliance or whatever. So I'm simply expecting that the new business models here, they will open up business interfaces to this network platform that I talked about, or you mentioned the network slices, which is just look at the network as your own network. You don't need to care about sharing it with somebody else. It's a logical network and it's your network, so you run it. If you're a car company, you run your logical network. But you need to interface with it. You need to pay for it, and that's where the new things on the business model side comes in. So you're basically saying that I'm a startup, I'm an SMB, I'm an enterprise, I have these needs globally, by the way. I want to have certain SLAs, certain connectivity. I'm willing to pay somewhat for it, but certainly there's a lot of bulk data that I'm not going to pay very much for. And that type of dynamic business interface I foresee to be a big part of the 5G rollout. It's a value that we haven't been able to realize yet in the existing systems, because we've been so focused on the smartphones and the consumer space. Now we're turning to all the other industries, we're turning to enterprises and making it work. So that's a new thing.
I'm excited about what this is going to do to help, especially the legacy auto companies, kind of catch up with the new kids on the block. You know, we've been, Tesla, of course, uses Wi-Fi to download and update to the car. You have to be plugged in, you have to be hooked up to Wi-Fi. And then over a period of hours, you can get a whole new operating system. You know, the new guys are kind of hesitant to go do that. I mean, the old guys, the existing guys. But once we have 5G, then still you're not going to do it while driving, but it's going to be a very quick process. It can be done without Wi-Fi. The whole connectivity changes things for updates. Now, for on-road driving, for example, there's a company locally, Platshon Technologies, where trucks form truck trains. The front truck is driven, the follow trucks literally follow, and the robot is happily following. That's the kind of thing where you do need persistent connectivity between the front truck and the back truck, and there's a fail-safe mode, so they pull apart if they lose connections. So there's a wide variety of applications, from, you know, downloading a movie to the kids in the back seat and in a few seconds to, you know, redoing the whole operating system of the car.
But let me go one level deeper with you, Mark. And there's, with all these different things that can happen with a car, you can do a software upload, or you can do entertainment in the car, or you can do vehicle-to-vehicle communications. It seems to me there might be 3 different business transactions for those 3 different electronic transactions. So how do you, what's the priority of the car company, to try to own any of that, or just to facilitate those transactions for other people?
You know, the car industry has spent the last 100 years making sure it gave away all the recurring revenue of the car. We worked really hard to give away all the oil and gasoline to the oil companies. We gave away all the insurance to the insurance companies, right? And we gave away all the service to the dealers. So we end up selling this thing. They're trying to figure out how to not do that again in the electric connected Uberized car world. So we're trying to figure out how to own the customer a little, and how to get some of the recurring revenue. Exactly how, not sure, but there's a lot of that is part of the thinking.
All right, so one of the things I want to explore is that we have a wide variety. We've just heard 7 different pitches from these startup companies, and they're so different. So when I look at that, I think, well, some of these could be served with LTE, some are low energy Bluetooth, some could be Wi-Fi or Sigfox or another low power wide area network, and some of them need a 5G IoT connection. So can you guys compare and contrast? Where do you think some of these applications fit, as far as which technologies really belong where, and where should 5G emerge as really saying, well, 5G will do something that none of those others can do?
Yeah, I think you can kind of segregate the use cases based upon a few different categories. One of them is power consumption, another one is range, third one is cost point, fourth is data and latency. So these are kind of technology level differentiators. And so, as I was showing in my slide, if you were here earlier, things like Bluetooth is useful for body area or personal area networks, which a cellular network is probably not going to do as good a job as maybe Bluetooth or its evolution. So in that sense, I can see a fair amount of segmentation based upon some of those geographical characteristics between Bluetooth as a personal area network, local area network, and cellular networks. Moving on the other end of the spectrum, you mentioned Sigfoxes and LoRa's, et cetera. I think what has happened in the industry is there's been an appetite for connecting things in the IoT, And the cellular space has been moderately slow to react in terms of actual solutions. So for example, with automakers, BMWs and other thingies are connected through an AT&T network, for example, in the US for connectivity maps, et cetera. But to get that connectivity, they probably spend 6 months to 2 years as a dedicated project to get automotive connectivity to a cellular network. And so what we're trying to do with 5G is both from an air interface perspective, provide the flexibility such that these different requirements can be met in one common unified air interface, but also from the network perspective, as Erik was mentioning a little earlier, is through network slicing. And I'll maybe give a 10-second explanation of that. I don't think I did a good job of that in the previous session. But the idea today is you have one core network that an operator manages, and all the services get into that network. As we've evolved different versions of the standard, we've added to the functionality of the network. And so you have one network that is pretty much an accumulation of everything we wanted to do in one monolith. What network slicing aims to do is to say, oh, IoT, I don't care about mobility for the water meter that's sitting out in your basement. So the mobility aspects of the core network, I don't need for that application. So I slice the network to enable security, to enable range and connectivity, but I don't worry about mobility and high data rates. And so that network slicing allows for different requirements. It allows for thinner network components, as well as then it allows for business models that enable an auto company to say, hey, I've got this new thingy, and I want to connect it to your network. Next week, over this weekend, let's work and get this thing up and going. And I think that's where 5G will bring, from a network architecture perspective, much quicker monetization.
Yes. But so you're asking also how these different things will play out. And I think it's important to remember that when we go through this technology cycle of developing something that would scale globally, it doesn't mean that we get it right first time. So some of the things that you today see as limited, perhaps proprietary systems, they are good indicators of use cases and needs that we have to fulfill from a global scale. And one thing when it comes to these embedded sensors, whether they are sort of meters in the city or they are things plowed down in a field or whatever, it doesn't work if they need to change battery every week or every 3 months. It has to be years, maybe 10 years even. So that's a very important requirement to make sure that you have an operational model that scales. And what is happening now is that these wide area technologies, versions or variants, releases of LTE, they are actually getting this capability. Really long battery lifetime and also really low data rates. So they will be able to carry all these, or this relatively limited, but anyway, this global traffic for IoT in sort of a mass market way. That's a good enabler. So that means that mid and long term, you will see those technologies dominate. Near term, you see a lot of experiments, I would call them, because someone is trying with a sort of local network, and that doesn't work long term, but it's a good starting point. And then also that some of the things here that are true, whether you are on Wi-Fi unlicensed, whether you're on Bluetooth or LTE or 5G, or fixed for that matter, is that some things needs to stay the same in a multi-access environment. Things that you care about, like application identities that and security mechanisms to give you access to the network, and that's important to guarantee the stability and security of the network infrastructure. So they are actually common. So there are a number of enablers that are not unique. Today they are unique, but we have to align them going forward so it's easier to develop applications that have these basic characteristics inbuilt, such as identity. And that comes back to the network slices that I talked about and you also mentioned. So I think those things are more common actually than the fact that you have different access technologies depending on the actual need.
Okay. Punit, do you see any applications? Do you see any applications that really need something that doesn't exist today?
I mean, I think anyone that's building a business and waiting for 5G might be waiting longer for the revenue than they need to be waiting. So I think it'd be silly to not be reverse compatible to other systems and have backups for communication. Anytime you've got this sheer explosion of devices that are going to come on and the bandwidth requirements as video and things sort of click on and overload certain networks, there's going to be lots of new applications that are going to pop up. And it's from an investment perspective, what we've been looking at is sort of this, we talked about it as well, as sort of the separation of software defining versus hardware and purpose-built boxes. We're starting to see a lot of traction in the market for actual adoption of real services, for virtualizing the core, some peripheral services, or whatever's out there. And so what they're enabling is they're enabling application developers, even enterprise developers, to build new services that are taking advantage of this ability to network slice or other things that are out there that people in the past didn't even exist. And working with the telco was impossible because the service wasn't made available for a third party to come on and do, unless you had a long sales cycle and dedicated engineers and NRE dollars that were thrown and whatever else. And so for new businesses as they come up, it seems like there's the first move to 4G, which is getting real penetration, the move to 5G, and the move to alternate services for connectivity. As a telco, if you enable access to all those to third parties, there's all kinds of new businesses that get created, right? So hopefully that's helpful.
Okay. Well, I want to make sure we give the audience a chance. Let's have questions from the audience.
How do consumer solutions like Android Audio play into this audio, auto, your kind of auto, BMW, play into this space?
Well,
The question is, how do applications like Android Auto play in
yeah.
5G space?
So Android Auto, iOS CarPlay are at this point they're primarily infotainment layer applications. They're not involved in safety critical systems. Most of the cars have a pretty good separation between safety critical systems. Reprogramming the ABS brakes is a different world than downloading a new music.
But that's the interface that the user knows and loves.
Right. The user the user will see some of the IoT 5G features as they come out. Many of the cars now have forward emergency braking. Most of it's driven purely by the radar sensor now. But over time, it's going to be driven by the vehicle-to-vehicle warning so that it's not just the car in front of you that says, I'm putting on the brakes, therefore you should. It can be the car 3 cars down that puts on the brakes, and everybody behind him puts on the brakes simultaneously without anybody doing anything, right? So you're going to see those things, but you're not, those are those invisibly wonderful things that happen in the background that hopefully you never even know it, hopefully you never need it, but it all happens.
There needs to be some user interface.
There's going to be, depending on your view of how autonomous driving evolves, there's going to be less and less user interface and more robot interface.
I am interested in exploring this idea of, there's a big difference between these high value applications, life critical applications versus entertainment or home automation or something else where there's a very low price point for every bit of data. And how does that separate? How do we develop those business models separately? And is it different hardware, different chipsets for each of those businesses?
So the analog today is, if you take voice communication over cellular network, if you remember that, it basically is a very high quality of service demanding application, although it's a very mundane application. And so those bits over the network are protected and are treated specially compared to what we call best effort or like an FTP file download or web page download. And that same concept extends to what I call mission critical applications, or as you said, things like vehicle-to-vehicle communication or remote surgery. And one could expect that since those are more demanding to the network, because it has to say, oh, if you need to alert me about this electric grid failure, I'm gonna pause all other communications. I'm gonna let this low latency, high reliability communication through, make sure it goes through and resume regularly scheduled programming. So it does put an extra burden on the network, which is this whole net neutrality debate. And I can expect that there will be, from an operator perspective, the desire to charge or monetize that because there's an extra cost on the network. At the same time as the application space will say, and regulators will say, no, you can't have fast lanes and slow lanes. From a technology standpoint, we're basically trying to put all those 3 major areas, mobile broadband, wide area Internet of Things, and mission critical applications, all those diverse and sometimes opposing requirements into one framework, the chessboard that I mentioned earlier, such that you don't build a but you don't build, a Corvette for, for the freeways and, a Jeep for off-road. You basically build a highway infrastructure or a road infrastructure over which various use cases can be fulfilled.
Erik, I'd love to get your comments on this too. The operators would need to be able to guarantee 4 nines or 5 nines of reliability to enable some of these business models to evolve. And what does the industry need to do to be able to guarantee that sort of SLA of service in a wireless context?
I agree this is a challenge because the networks that we have today, they were originally voice network built mainly for cars here in North America at least, meaning that it's relatively sparse grid. So that means that it's difficult to get perfect network connectivity everywhere, certainly if you're outside of those main areas. So one thing is, of course, to match up the networking part or the connectivity part with the actual needs. And they may be located where you have not only densely populated areas, but certain areas where you have industrial automation going on and things like that. So I think that will have to change to match the needs, not only of where users are, but where there is a need for these critical applications. And the cars, I think, is an obvious example. There isn't enough money, I believe, to develop these separate networks for cars, which was an idea 15 years ago. Instead, you have to do exactly what you said here. You have to slice and make sure that you get the SLA confirmed and honored, but it's a shared infrastructure, and that shared infrastructure need then to cover everything from critical to non-critical applications. But when we do that, I think that it also means that we can't just put more of the same into the network. If you want to have this extreme robustness and resilience, you need to put duplicate infrastructure in place in some cases because of failures or security breaches and other things that you need to deal with. You also have to look at it both on the network layer and on the application layer. So some of it will be solved by really having good reliability on the network. Other things still has to be done on the application layer. So a lot of more infrastructure actually is needed to cover these needs.
Okay, I see a bunch of questions in the audience. Let's start up front here.
Having so many experts. Thank you. Having so many experts in the panel and thinking about the future, I just want to pose the question. Do you think it will be possible to charge those things once over the wireless? And how long will it go if yes? So then the power consumption as one of the 4 axes, one of the 4 problems won't be anyone anymore.
Wireless charging. You mean charging without the wire, not wirelessly charging, I guess. No power via the 3G or 4G or 5G network. But of course, you have wireless charging already today. So it's a question more about implementation.
Yeah, so I know the Qualcomm, we've been working on this, and we have wireless charging both for cars. So Formula E there's a BMW i8, I believe, that has wireless charging. So at a car level, so that kind of joules or wattage use cases, but also there's wireless charging that we and others in the industry enable for smartphones. You have these little surfaces you put your phone on. So yeah, I think wireless charging is the other wireless that's being worked on quite heavily.
I see another question in the back. Do we have another microphone for the back of the room? Thank you.
Just picking up on your comments about net neutrality. So given your wireless background, can you foresee a world where there is a fixed ground internet like the fiber and the cable, where the packets are treated by regulation or otherwise completely neutrally? However, we've moved into this wonderful world of a global communal LTE model where the packets may necessarily be required to be treated quite differently. And that has obviously an implication, which is the question, as to what does that look like when you lose the ubiquity of our wonderful little TCP packet.
I think I stepped on a landmine, and I knew as soon as I uttered the phrase net neutrality, I shouldn't have. But so I'll steer away from the controversy. We have the luxury of doing that, being the company that we are. But I think another interesting thing that's happening is you mentioned fixed and wireless, and as far as new business models and monetization of wireless, there are a large number of operators who are really doing the fixed mobile convergence, and so they can't be speaking through both ends of their mouth, saying one thing on the fixed side and one thing on the wireless side. And as operators aim to get more of the value chain, that value chain includes fixed, it includes the content, and includes wireless. What you're also seeing is that the fixed operators are making a hue and cry, well, not a hue and cry, but at least making noise about net neutrality not being fair. So even today in the US, there are data caps, which in some cases are executed and some are not. So I think there'll be a blurring of lines, at least from a regulatory perspective, and actually to some extent from a technological perspective, between fixed and wireless.
Okay, I know we have another question in the very back.
So, as the 5G grows and the devices that are connected is in the 20s of billions of things, it seems that cybersecurity grows even faster, maybe exponentially with that. And if everything's connected and the infrastructure is connected, the weakest link is the source of trouble for the most valuable part of that link. Say a car driving the road is hacked into by a washing machine or something like that. Lots of people have written about that. Could you guys comment a little bit about how 5G and cybersecurity and whether or not things can be done at this level, at this layer, that make the whole systems more secure?
Well, I can try to give an answer on that, and maybe others want to fill in. So security in cellular systems has been sort of a key requirement and something that's been looked at very carefully from the beginning. I think we're in the fortunate situation that we have a good architecture when it comes to dealing with the network itself. But the difference now going into 5G and going into these more open systems is, of course, that this is not specified in the same way. So there is a bigger threat surface, and that comes partly from the cloudification, partly it comes from simply new use cases that were not thought of before. We are not confined to smartphones any longer, or phones. So obviously this is an area where we can't stay with what we had in the early system up until 4G. So I would say that security, and coupled with that, authentication and identity handling for 5G is a key area. It's a key area both in terms of what the standard actually mandates, so that you don't let unsecure devices onto the network. You make sure that you keep them outside of the network, but also that the network itself need to fulfill much stricter security requirements than before. Some of those users out there that we hope to bring on top of one of these logical slices, they have much higher security requirements than current use cases, and that has to be catered for as well. So that means that having critical infrastructure services running on top of this shared set of logical networks, that means more security on a node level, obviously, but certainly end to end. So I think that's just it's a given that that's going to be significantly improved, if you like, or significantly changed from where we were just a few years ago.
It seems that this is one of the strengths of the 3GPP standards in general, is that they really have not been hacked. Many of the other standards have been broken, but the 3G and 4G networks out there now, I've heard very few stories, and maybe I've never heard any stories of significant breaches in that security.
It comes down to the architecture that I mentioned, and also the fact that it's solid when it comes to hardware security and implementations that are not as vulnerable as some of the other systems that you alluded to.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question here.
So you mentioned some pretty interesting latency numbers, like 1 millisecond, which is pretty impressive. My question is, how does this work when you think about the whole end-to-end connectivity picture? Because yes, you have 5G, which is super low latency, but then in the middle you've got a TCP/IP network, which, as we know, doesn't make any such guarantees, and that network can be like hundreds of milliseconds, maybe even. So can you comment about how this whole thing is going to evolve? Because to me, 1 millisecond latency doesn't make much sense if the rest of the network is not capable of doing
good point.
that.
So first I should qualify that the 1 millisecond end-to-end latency I talk about is to the first IP hop, right? So from the terminal to the first IP hop, which then actually brings up the whole trend of either mobile edge computing or distributing content to the edge. So there are certainly no-brainer applications such as an industrial automation scenario where you have a robot sitting in a factory, your core network is just nearby, there is no further hop beyond that core network, and that 1 millisecond latency is the bulk of the pie. And then if you move the content to the edge, so mobile edge caching, it's already been done on the fixed internet, it's already being done in the wireless internet. I know Ericsson has some announcements earlier. You then cut away at the latency introduced by the wide internet. The third aspect is even in cases where you don't have the content at the edge, the 5G architectural discussions are looking at enhancements not just on the air interface, but also how do we reduce latency within the 3GPP core network, and then of course the IETF in general is looking at, and the industry in general is looking at how to reduce latency from the 3GPP network to the end servers.
Punit, any comments on latency and how, are you doing anything like this in caching data in the Singtel network? How are you looking at that as far as your overall technology vision?
Yeah, I think I'm probably not the right person to comment directly on that fact. I guess what became apparent in the conversation talking about some things in security and applications is that 5G is part of the equation, but that's not the only part of the equation to think through. In the example of what's your attack surface and where you're being attacked from a secure perspective, the reason why it seems like the cell networks are safe is because there's much weaker spots to attack. If you wanted to attack the network, you go and compromise the enterprise application. There's just too many open doors. So why go after the most closed door that's out there? It doesn't make any sense. And it seems like 5G is going to have that same level of inherent protection because of the standards and the architecture and everything else that's out there. The weakness really comes into how do you integrate other standards to the 5G network? And I think that's really the open question that's out there.
Very good. I think that's all we have time for. So please join me in thanking our panel.